All right, 18 minutes. All right. Thinking about shifting to equity as a preferred driver for economic and community development partly requires thinking about what we're shifting from. So currently we have local, regional, national, and even global economic structure that is, in my opinion, far too dependent on waste. And that waste is pretty profound in that we waste a lot of things, including our natural resources: water, air, soil, trees, fill in the blank, fish, a lot of fish. We waste food. We waste energy. In the Tompkins County area, we've got 40,000 buildings that are trying to actually heat up our whole atmosphere. That's a lot of waste. We waste people. We waste individuals at a scale that is hard to imagine. The United States has 5% of the global population and 25% of the global incarcerated people. We waste whole neighborhoods. Those of you who are old enough to remember Love Canal, a neighborhood that got wasted by toxic waste. Urban renewal through the 70s and 80s that destroyed whole neighborhoods. We waste whole communities. We have an agricultural policy that basically dooms rural communities all over the country by making it almost impossible for small farmers to keep their small farms. And ultimately our behavior, while it isn't going to waste the planet's more resilient than we have any power to actually destroy. Could destroy all life on the planet, that would be the 6th time. So waste becomes a huge structural problem for us, and so thinking about how to shift to equity as a preferred driver for what we do also requires paying some attention to what the structure is for poverty in our community. Now, in my talk, what I'm talking about is eliminating structural poverty. I'm not necessarily talking about eliminating poverty itself. I'm not sure what that would look like. But the structure that we have in the Tompkins County region with about 100,000 people is one in which we have 300 families or thereabouts since the 2010 census whose income is below the federal poverty guidelines. And across the county, 1,300 families, including those 300, and about 1,000 people who are chronically hard to employ. Now, what's important about those numbers is that they've been stable for about 4 decades. And that's why I think of it as structural. Those numbers don't change very much, although in the Tompkins County area, we've got a really robust economy. We've got the lowest unemployment rate in the state and have, again, for many years, partly because of the power of our higher education institution as a driver of our economy. But what this and the other reason to stay with families, although that doesn't describe all of the individuals, is that as soon as you go to individuals from the census, then we have a whole lot of students in the mix who aren't making a lot of money as students, and they skew those figures. So to get the students out of the mix, I stay with families. That gives us a fairly realistic view. It doesn't give us a view of what poverty looks like in terms of income completely, because we know that there's also a lot of underemployment. And it doesn't have the individuals that are not students that are also, whose income is below the poverty level. So one of the things I just point out in terms of the structures, we have a fairly robust engine in our community that I call the poverty pump, or the poverty engine. And its job is to feed, clothe, house, shelter, provide emergency medical care to people in that low-income bubble that I'm calling it. And its job is not particularly to get them out of that bubble. It actually does a pretty good job of feeding, housing, clothing for the most part. We have fairly low homelessness, but there is some. But it does a pretty good job of doing those things. And that's a lot of, a significant part of our local economy. There's another sector, the criminal justice sector, that also has a lot of money in it, a lot of jobs in that sector. And its job, from my point of view, essentially is, again, particularly for the black and brown boys and rural boys, to, when they cycle out of that poverty bubble into the criminal justice sector, particularly if they go to state or federal prison, That's a breadwinner that the family no longer has. If they come back into the community, they're essentially barred from employment, and so there's a mouth to feed that isn't able to produce an income, at least not legally. There's also, in our public education system, this is where things start getting really interesting, a structure in which we can predict largely by last name and by third grade which children are going to cycle into that poverty pump and which children are going to cycle into the criminal justice pump. We can predict that based on who's reading at grade level by third grade. So our criminal justice system basically plans for what kind of cells we're going to need based on that number. People who go through the public education system and are not going on to higher education and are not career ready, a footnote is that about 80% of the people who go through our public education system in the Tompkins County area are actually going to go on to higher education. Those who are not are going on to a low-wage job. That keeps their income fairly precarious. It does not actually get them out of that. Poverty engine is just some money that sort of cycles through their family and basically keeps them in that family. Now, the argument that people will make that I am trying to counter here is that that is not a result of our structure, that that's a result of poor people making bad choices, having dysfunctional families, and essentially having something wrong with them, either in terms of character, will, or ability. While those are factors for some families, and there's no doubting that, I think it's completely structural. It's a structure that, in fact, has been invented in my lifetime. I watched it get invented. And all of these factors actually create what I'm calling a brick wall that keeps people in that low-income bubble from establishing what I'm calling ownership. And by ownership, I mean access to a living wage job. By a living wage job, I mean a job that gives somebody enough income to actually start to develop wealth, own property, which is one of the signals of wealth, at least in our society. Access to capital and credit. In the 1950s, there was a huge influx of capital and credit, particularly to white people through the GI Bill and through the Federal Housing Administration, and that exploded the middle class. So we know that giving people access to capital and credit is a way to expand wealth, a way to create ownership. We don't live in a political environment that's at all likely to make that happen now, particularly in terms of federal and state policy. So if we're going to do something about access to capital, we're going to have to figure out how to do it locally, and I'm looking forward to what Bill has to say about that. Entrepreneurship. In the most robust economy, we're not going to produce enough new jobs to actually solve this problem, and that means making it possible for people to create their own income. People are actually doing that just fine now, but it's not legal, so figuring out ways to make that legal for people to do would be, again, part of what we would need to work on. And the last one is participation. For a lot of reasons, mainly having to do with how we structure our power relationships across race, class, and place, people in that low-income bubble are either closed out of the actual decision-making that goes on in this community or marginalized in terms of that decision-making. So what I'm talking about is creating a structure that removes that brick wall. Now, there's one other piece of this that's important, and that is that locally we have a really robust workforce development system, including the school system that I said 80% of those people are actually going on to higher ed. We also have Workforce New York and a lot of other kinds of job training programs. The structural problem is that the link between individuals in that low-income bubble and those processes is actually weak. Some individuals don't know they exist. If they get to them, it's hard to do. If they live in Newfield, it's hard to get to. So that's one weak link. The much more important, actually, is that the link between going through that process and a living wage job is also very weak. So I can get my GED, I can get credentials, and there is no anything like a guarantee that there will be a living wage job waiting for me at the end of that process. Now, if I've been doing this for 3 or 4 generations in my family, the psychological risk of stepping into that process with no guarantee that it does anything for me financially is actually pretty high. That's my argument, that it's not about it's not primarily about character or will or even ability. People are pretty smart about seeing the structure that's available to them and the psychological risks they're willing to take. So what would we have to do? To create a different structure would mean, first of all, in removing the brick wall, we'd actually strengthen the link between the low-income bubble, workforce development, and a living wage job. So that just as a student who goes to college knows that if they do what they're supposed to do, keep their grades up, they will get a degree. That's guaranteed. That's what's going to happen. Likewise, if we had a structure that said if you get your credentials, you go through this process, there will be a living wage job waiting for you at the end. It's not going to quite be accurate, or you will be prepared to create your own income through entrepreneurship, through your own efforts. So our workforce development system, including the school system, would have to be structured to prepare young people upon graduation, both for participation in civic life, which is not guaranteed now, but particularly for entrepreneurship, which is not even structured into our school system. Further, our workforce development system would not only need to be structured to help people get credentials for a job, but actually develop the skills and tools they need to create their own income through entrepreneurship. Now, the other piece of it is that if I'm an adult, I'm going into a low-income job, then we would need structures that actually create a pathway from those low-income jobs to living wage jobs, as opposed to cycling back into that poverty pump. And the last thing is we would have to figure out ways to get people access to capital and credit, because people who are interested in entrepreneurship or in buying a home absolutely need access to capital and credit. The problem we're going to have to solve in doing that is that federal and state guidelines make that extremely difficult to do. And so we're going to have to figure out how to do it locally. If we do those things, if we create those pathways, if we create access to capital and credit, then what starts to happen is people in that low-income bubble now, who are actually the fuel for the poverty engine and the fuel for the criminal justice engine, stop being the fuel for those pumps. And they start being the fuel for an equity engine in our economy that actually begins to reduce waste in a lot of different areas, but particularly in terms of human potential. Now, that all said, there are some particular leverage points that I think are useful to pay attention to. One of them is children that are ready for school by kindergarten. Now, we can predict by last name who's not going to be ready for school by kindergarten, and we can predict many of the factors that make that the case, transportation being one of them. Access to enough food to not be going hungry every day, that's another one. And if we put together the resources to actually make every child school ready by kindergarten, we could conceivably stop there and wait a generation, we'd be done. I don't think that's a great idea, but that's why I say we could actually do this in a generation. The number of children we're talking about by age group is probably 100 children in each age group. So it's not a large number of kids. Another one is that one that I pointed out before, third grade literacy and numeracy, really ready to pass the state and federal tests when the federal tests start showing up, because they will, by third grade, and that's also a relatively small number of children. Now, the reason I think those are useful leverage points is because if we focused attention on those two, there's a few more, but if we focus attention on those two and do them successfully, it means that we will solve some of our transportation problems, particularly for people in rural communities, that we will have solved some of our food distribution problems, because children who are hungry can't do well in school. We will have solved some of our social support problems, particularly over the summer, when children from low-income families often don't get the same kind of continued access to an educational process that other children get through those 2 months, and then start to lag behind, and that becomes another part of our structural problem. Another really important was job ready and higher ed ready. I think the technical words for that are career ready and college ready upon exit from high school. Now, this is a really important one in terms of our structure. It may be the most challenging one. For the 80% that are going on to higher ed, what they get is not a guaranteed job. But what they for sure get is 2 4 or 6 more years of adult support, a place to live, access to food, right? And for a 16 or 17-year-old who's not going through that system, that is 20% of the kids that go through our school system, they don't get any of that. And we're looking at people that one could argue are developmentally in the place where that support is actually really necessary. We have nothing in the community that's structured to provide that support, and yet have created an economic system in which those people have to make decisions that are going to determine the trajectory of their economic life for the rest of their lives. In that 2 to 3 year period between 16 and 19, we have nothing structured in the community for dealing with that. So that would be a pretty big one to shift. And then, so related to that is support for the 18 to 30-year-olds who to become at least job ready, if not higher ed ready. Now, we'd also need to link job readiness to living wage jobs, because linking job readiness to Walmart doesn't actually get anybody to the place where they achieve ownership. And then a much more robust system for supporting entrepreneurship. And that's not just access to capital, it's also access to the kinds of things that somebody can learn about how to start a small business and how to actually make it likely to succeed. So there's some things that are in the way. So you can start to imagine this now? Are you able to imagine it before you walked in? Right, so one thing that's in the way is there's no one entity whose job it is to create a different structure. And there's a lot of entities whose job it is to preserve what we have. Lack of imagination. It's very hard for people to imagine that we could actually eliminate structural racism or eliminate structural poverty. Old habits of mind and behavior. Habits of mind and behavior about the way things are the way they're supposed to be. People are where they are because they deserve to be in those places. That it has nothing to do with the structure that we've built around people's lives. Our current relationships across race, class, and place. I'll just say a couple things about that one. We have rural populations that are afraid to be in the city. What city, you might ask, in this area? We have people living on the hills where the smart people are that are afraid to go downtown. Now, there's just a couple. We've got white and dark people who actually never see each other, literally never see each other. So those are pieces of our relationships across race, class, and place. But the main thing is that we haven't decided to do it. As a community, we just haven't decided to do it. I'm optimistic because the scale's manageable. I've talked about that some. We're poised to make some capital investment in some key areas. We got 40,000 leaky buildings. We're about to actually seal them up. That's going to be a lot of jobs. We have low housing stock in the city of Ithaca. We're about to build a whole bunch of houses. That's another whole set of jobs. We've got a whole bunch of baby boomers who are about to leave their jobs over the next 10 years. That's a whole other area of job availability for people. So all that's part of it. Some school districts are much more intentional now about solving that educational piece of the problem. They're going to need a lot of community support to be successful. And we've started the conversation about actually eliminating structural poverty and structural racism. What makes this community unique in terms of some of the others that are much more economically depressed is we actually have the resources to do it. And we have a lot of the tools to do it. So some things we'll need to do is to make a community-wide decision. One of the things that I spend a lot of my days doing is organizing and supporting and facilitating those conversations so that we're in the place, hopefully by sometime this spring, to say, yep, we're doing it. To build and maintain a local structure that produces reliable pathways out of poverty. As we invest in greater energy efficiency in our food system, that we make sure that the jobs that get created by that actually serve to bring people in that low-income bubble into living wage jobs or into entrepreneurship. Much more development of a support system for entrepreneurship. And then the other really big one is local buying, to really increase both our local investment and our local buying as a source of an economic driver for the whole community, but also particularly for getting people out of that low-income bubble. So we can design something. I mean, you've looked at the part of a design right there. And the most elegant design is not going to work if we do not build and repair our relationships across race, class, and place. It's probably going to be the most challenging thing to do, so everybody could just be thinking about who you hang out with and who you don't hang out with and why, and whether that's something you're willing to change. And I think I'm done.